From a broader perspective, when we think about American punishment, criminologists tend to talk about it in certain ways, and I'm wondering if there are certain perspectives or considerations that we tend to miss when we talk about punishment.
So I think that the question of explaining mass incarceration and America's punitive penal system, I think that's been on the agenda for about 15 years now. And I'd say that over that time there's been a whole variety of approaches, cultural and political science and economic and sociological. I think that there's a rather comprehensive account of that historical change. What I think is less well developed and needs to be brought more into focus is comparative studies, thinking about the US as compared to other nations. And I think that when we think of comparative studies, we can't simply rely on one-dimensional measures like the rate of imprisonment and say, well, the USA is clearly more punitive because it imprisons more. We have to take that together with understandings of the problems to which punishments respond in, crime rates, violence rates, and so on. And we haven't begun to do that, actually. I mean, the difficulties of comparing one nation's penal system and crime problem with another are much more complex.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the utility of multidisciplinary approaches and perhaps the challenges that are associated with trying to work in a multidisciplinary way.
The study of incarceration, of policing, and crime and punishment in the United States has largely been the preserve of criminologists and sociologists, and has involved other social sciences, perhaps somewhat less centrally. Psychology and social psychology for sure. Economics, anthropology maybe less centrally, but also involve history. And I've been hearing recently from historians about how important it is that serious historical perspective be brought to bear on the study of these issues. So that creates a situation where people with different methods, different data, different expertise, different, if you will, academic cultures from their respective disciplines, different masters in the sense of communities to whom they're responsible to demonstrate their competency, their proficiency, have to talk to each other about the common problem. There are problems, to be sure. Not speaking the same language is a little bit of a Tower of Babel kind of effect, as the statistics-driven econometrician tries to make sense out of what the narrative-focused historian is talking about. I know this because I have had to try to make sense out of what some of these historians are talking about. But it also, I think, opens up opportunities because the nature of these problems, we're talking about criminal justice, but I think the point could be made much more broadly, is multivalent, multifaceted. These are problems rooted in history, engaging governance and political process, having implications for budgets and for people's incentives, requiring to be rooted in the examination of evidence, which brings in the quantitative methods for assessing what evidence might be available and so on. So they are intrinsically interdisciplinary questions raised by criminal justice policy, and to be effectively dealt with, it seems to me they must engage the expertise across these disciplines, notwithstanding the difficulty that we scholars sometimes have in understanding each other across our respective boundaries.
One thing I have noticed is that religion plays a big part in discussions about prisons. So, and this is true historically. I mean, the penitentiary came out of religious movements. When the penitentiary came to America, you had Quakers going in all the time, monitoring, seeing, are people being mistreated in prison or not? Talking to prisoners, etc. The Catholic Church has been really invested in things like punishment, and in fact has been very outspoken on capital punishment, thanks to Sister Helen Prejean. When I looked at this material, I noticed movement in the 1970s among evangelical Christians that really was tough on crime, really recommending, for instance, corporal punishment. In some cases, some of Jerry Falwell's sermons do this, etc. Some advocated stoning. These are neo-Calvinists. actually advocated a return to stoning. There were also groups of Christians who advocated corporal punishment of children as a way to keep them out of crime. So, what really interested me is in the process of writing this book, I tried to get some of those groups to talk to me. And I called them all up and tried to get them to tell me what's going on now, how do you feel about crime? And they referred me to Prison Fellowship. Now, Prison Fellowship has in some ways a very different take on crime. It is very concerned about what's going on for the safety of inmates, cares about their well-being. So we're talking about a huge shift in evangelical Christianity in terms of really starting to care about the inmate. That requires seeing the inmate as human.
Could you talk a little bit about victims' rights discourse in Europe and how that differs from the US?
Yeah, because of course human rights also refer to human rights for victims and protection of the rights and the interests of victims. But again, I think the difference is that Europe has chosen for protection of victims in their own rights, meaning you have to care for victims, you have to support them, but not the rhetoric that if you punish the offender more severely, that automatically saves the victim from all the traumas that it has suffered. So we think that you can do both. You can protect victims better, you have to do that. And you can also work for making offenders less recidivating, being less dangerous when they come out of prison than when they went into.
Right.
So we want to do both at the same time. But again, that's the official European policy. It doesn't mean necessarily that members of the public automatically think of that.
General public attitudes are uninformed attitudes, and uninformed attitudes in the Netherlands, in Europe, in the US are punitive attitudes, and they remain punitive attitudes. We have measures going back 3 or 4 decades showing that more than 80% of the Dutch population, and I've seen these kind of statistics for other countries as well, more than 80% throughout the years consider sentences to be too lenient. Now, if you compare that to actual developments in incarceration rates, for instance, it's disconnected from each other. So actual developments in sentencing and public discontent in terms of punitiveness, they don't correlate. And there's a third factor, which is confidence or trust in the judicial system. If you look at the number of different measures for that, down-to-earth measures, it's also more or less a flat rate of a reasonable level of confidence. So the same people who say that sentences are too lenient also express, in my own research, also express that they are rather confident in the fact that judges do a good job.
How optimistic are you about the penal climate changing? I've been really interested in the movement on the right in this question, and a lot of folks with evangelical roots and evangelical justifications for their approaches to this stuff have been using the word redemption a lot. And I'm just wondering if that leads you to be more optimistic, that we can have a shift in the way we conceive of offenders.
In general, I'm as skeptical as all of us are about the current moment and bipartisan. We've been here before with left and right coalescing, and it always ends up for the worse. And so we have to be skeptical. But I think one of the positiveness has come out of your own writing. One of the positive signs about this left-right coalition is that it started with reentry and started with the kind of redeemability question that I'm talking about. Now, the way reentry is posed on both sides, I think it's problematic. On the left, it's much too need-based, and it's, we want to help these people, let's throw some programs at them. On the right, I think it's too faith-based, and the problems in that history of criminal justice. But nonetheless, it has opened the door, the reentry, and Louis Kwan and others have been very skeptical about just how genuine any of this belief in reentry is, and I think that there's definitely justified in what a small drip in a huge sea of punitiveness. But I think that drip has opened the door, if I can really mix bizarre metaphors. I see some hope in that drop, and I think that drop has opened the door a conversation about the people in prison, the people we imprison as fellow human beings, in the sense that you can't be for reentry in the way that advocates on left and right are saying they're for, without, at some level, saying that I would open the door to having an ex-prisoner part of the conversation. And when you bring ex-prisoners to the table and humanize them in the way that we were talking about earlier, I think automatically you're going to see a change in conversation and policy as well. So I think I have a lot of hope for where we could go with this current interest in reentry.
90 to 95% of criminal convictions in the U.S. result from guilty pleas, most of those induced by prosecutors offering limited concessions to offenders, with no validation ever by a judge or any other institution of the appropriateness of the conviction or the disposition. As a Federal Circuit Court, a Second Circuit Court of Appeals judge here in New York, Gerald Lynch, has pointed out, in the federal courts in the U.S. and to a growing extent in the state courts, prosecutors not only decide whether someone should be convicted, but what sentence they should receive. Lynch bluntly says, in most cases, the judge has nothing to do with it. That is not, there's no other English-speaking or Western European country in which that's true.
I think it's an important political opening that we haven't had in a long time. I think the enormity of the problem and the solutions are daunting. I think that we have so much focus on this top-down elite solution that may be right for the moment, but what we need is a long-term social movement. And social movements don't happen overnight. And we often think the civil rights movement began the day that Rosa Parks decided she wasn't going to sit in the back of the bus anymore. We forget that there were decades of organizing before that, going back to tenant farmers in the 1930s in the South, that had this long historical trajectory of the civil rights movement, and that she was part of those institutions in that movement. And the question is then, how do we create the conditions for that kind of social movement? And I think hitching it to the right of crime now is playing to the political moment, but it's not, like Michelle Alexander talks about, this kind of more visionary, long-term movement that we need.